Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, I got a super exciting and super fun episode for you guys today because we're putting Analogue 3D up against an Ultra HDMI modded N64. Because when I did the Analogue 3D versus MiSTer FPGA comparisons, a couple of people asked why I didn't do N64 first, because obviously that is what Analogue 3D is going up against primarily, and that is just because in the comments way more people asked to see it against MiSTer than the original N64. So I always had planned to make both of these videos. It was just a scheduling thing as to which one I decided to run first. So today we're going to be putting the Analogue 3D up against the actual N64, and just so you know, settings wise, the Ultra HDMI is just the only thing going on the N64, and on Analogue 3D it is set to original hardware mode, so it'll be doing exactly what it thinks it needs to be doing. And honestly, it's going to be a fun time to put these things side by side, because just like MiSTer FPGA, it is incredibly close as to what the Analogue 3D does versus a Nintendo 64. Now obviously the Nintendo 64 is going to have some disadvantages, at least at stock, because of course you're going to have the 4 controller ports up front and everything else that you would need to interact with the N64, but of course the Analogue 4K in box is going to ship with a lot more features that N64 is just either never going to have or going to be very expensive to add to it. And that really is the advantage, because again, the setup is basically the same. Both are pieces of hardware. They're going to run the cartridges and you're going to be able to play every single game, but by default a stock N64 is just going to be compositor S video out. If you want something like RGB, or if you want HDMI out, especially 4K, you're going to have a lot of mods in this system and a lot of scalers to deal with it as well. But let's jump right into the comparisons. Here you will see if it's N64 source footage in the bottom left hand corner of the screen, you'll see an N64. And if it's Analogue 3D, you're going to see an Analogue 3D. Now do be aware that there's more than one mod out there on the market for N64 and actually having HDMI. This is just the hardware I have access to, and big thanks to Kilter Music for doing the captures for N64, because my actual console is just bone stock. I plug it in S-Video to my PVM and play games. But it's one of those things, as far as the color and gamut is concerned, this is set to modern right here, and you will see a bit of a tonal shift across N64 as well as Analogue 3D, but do remember, capture hardware, the device you're watching it on, can all affect the overall color balance and saturation. The one thing I can't regulate is what type of screen you actually watch this on, so depending on your color calibration, it might be a little bit different to you than it is to me. And just so you know, I have RGB calibrated monitors for production, so they are color accurate when I look at it. So I'm talking about the overall colors. It's definitely something that I at least have the science behind. Let's move into our first soundtrack sample. First we're going to do the Analogue 3D, and then we're going to move into the Ultra HDMI, because I do think there actually is a pretty decent sound difference between the two.
Get bonus!
Now in my opinion, the Analogue 3D audio just has more warmth, more depth, and more overall tonal range than you see here on the N64 with the Ultra HDMI mod. And I totally get it, audio just like video quality is subjective, but it is one of those things. I would pick the Analogue 3D every day of the week and twice on Sundays, but you leave me a comment down below and you tell me what you think. And before you ask me to test the other HDMI mod on the market for N64, I just don't have the time or the money to go ahead and get another N64 with another modification in, because contrary to popular opinion, I am not a rich person, even though some people on YouTube seem to think that I have billions of dollars in the bank. But it's time to do a locked off sequence here with a cutscene from Sin and Punishment when you actually turn on the game, and we're going to have to get some very technical explanations here to explain why sometimes you will see drift even if both things seem to be doing the exact same thing at once. That is down to frame rates or exhibition rates. Now the Nintendo 64 by default outputs a 59.94 frame per second cadence, where the Analogue 3D does exactly 60 frames per second or 60.00, and even though those only seem to be fractions, and they definitely are, they are going to affect the the overall pacing of how that video comes out of the back of the N64 or the Analogue 3D. It is just one of those things, very small rounding errors compound over time, and you can actually end up with drifting sequences. The reason it's 59.94 is very technically complex, has to do with a lot of different audio options, and it isn't really a thing that I need to get into all that deeply, but just remember 59.94 and 60 frames per second are different. It is 6/100ths of a second slower or faster depending on which direction you are doing that math in, and that is something that we do have to accommodate for when we actually compare these two sequences side by side, whether it's MiSTer FPGA versus Analogue 3D or Analogue 3D versus N64. That's the point in time where we actually have to do some math so I can explain it to you a little bit more clearly. So as far as the sequence is concerned, it was locked at 2 minutes and 20 seconds, throwing away any frames at the beginning or the end that were a rounding error that wouldn't make a complete second. And we are losing 6/100ths of a frame at the broadcast rate of N64 versus the Analogue 3D. That means there's 8400 frames per second at 60 frames per second at Analogue 3D, and that means there's going to be 8391.6 frames at 5994 on real N64 hardware. That is a difference of 8.4 frames drift over the course of that test. That means it is a mathematical impossibility for the Analogue 3D and the N64 to keep pace just based upon those alternate frame rates. Now, one other interesting observation I made in the differences between Analogue 3D and real N64 hardware with the Ultra HDMI mod is the 240p to 480i changeover in Resident Evil. Watch where the screen is here, and suddenly it is going to be a little bit bigger. That is because at that corner there's actually changing the overall aspect ratio, because it is changing the actual refresh rate from 240p to 480i. Now watch the exact same scene unfold on real N64 hardware with the Ultra HDMI mod. Now again, this is modded hardware and it's handling this for you, but you will see here that there isn't going to be any sort of discrepancy in screen size between one cut to the other. As we come in here with glare, you can see that little flash, but it does stay the same size. And let's move over to another locked off cut sequence here, one that would have a lot less drift because it's going to be a lot shorter, and you're going to have an audio sample on both so you can hear how close they are, and then we'll be right back with more.
Freeze! Who are you? What are you doing here?
Don't shoot! I'm a human!
Ooh. Sorry about that, babe. I thought you were one of them.
What's going on in this town?
Hold on. I ain't got no clue, darling. By the time I noticed something was wrong, the entire city was infested with zombies.
Now the interesting thing there is if you actually pay attention right now to this fade where it goes from letterbox to regular widescreen, that's a 16 frame difference in letterbox fade completion rates. That means that these sources are off 16 frames, and with the math I previously showed you, that means it's mathematically impossible to lose that many frames just by drift. So it is one of those things that's not quite adhering 100% to N64, but neither MiSTer FPGA, so they all seem to be slightly off, which is fine. Again, if I didn't measure these things, I would never actually be able to tell you that they were there because you would never notice the difference. Let's move over to just some overall cadence tests here. First, we have blast core on the Ultra HDMI mod, and I would say everything is smooth, everything is fluid. It is the blast core that I remember and pretty much think is a decent B tier game. If we move over to the Analogue 3D, again on the original hardware mode, I would say that this is an area in which the color rendition is way more accurate and way more pleasing to the eye on the Analogue 3D. I think the Ultra HDMI has the tendency to get a little bit hot and washed out in certain games and certain brightnesses. Now, I don't think that the Analogue 3D is 100% perfect on its gamma curves or color reproduction either, and at least the recording of this video, the HDR implementation really isn't that effective. But honestly, that's not really surprising because so many bits of hardware have really poor HDR implementation. I sometimes actually have to master in HDR for clients, and it's one of those things. I always have to fight Windows to actually get a decent image out of it because even Microsoft can't seem to get that implementation correct. Let's move over to Bomberman Hero, hands down, and I will tell you this all day long, my favorite game on the N64, and one of my favorite games of all time. Is it going to be an audio soundtrack sample time? Because one, I think the Bomberman Hero soundtrack is some of the best music ever put to gaming, and two, it is another area in which you can definitely tell the difference in audio quality between real hardware with an HDMI mod and Analogue 3D. So go ahead and listen to N64 first, Analogue 3D second, and I'll be right back. Both soundtrack samples definitely sound great because Bomberman Hero is still the best soundtrack ever put to a video game, and I will fight you in the comments if you disagree. But Analogue 3D definitely takes the edge on audio quality as far as a real N64 with the Ultra HDMI mod. It's warmer, has more rich tones, and it just is more pleasing to my ear. But audio quality, just like video color and overall brightness, is going to be very subjective, so you might completely disagree, and that is fine. Let's do one more and the last locked off soundtrack sample, and I'll be right back with a bit more.
Dear Mario, please come to the castle. I'll be there to keep you. Yours truly, Princess Toadstool. Peach.
So again, a scenario in which it's not completely locked off, and if you're wondering where the actual cut was there, or where I was actually pasting it to, when Lakaitu has the third person view, when he's circling the pipe, versus when it actually goes into first person, or Lakaitu's camera, that is the frame I matched on, so you'll see in that footage there, if you slow it down, or even scrub frame by frame on YouTube, that is where it locks. So it definitely is still a situation where you're not getting 100% persistence on the frame rate locking and the cadence in the footage. That could be something on the Analogue 3D that is loading in assets ever so slightly quicker, but it is one of the major differences. And again, it's the reality of the situation. I'm not even telling you what footage you're watching now for Super Mario 64. One's Ultra HDMI, one is Analogue 3D, and you might not even be able to tell the difference. And that kind of is really the fun thing as far as these comparisons are concerned. Some of it is very scientific, actually using math and rounding data from the frame rates from the Analogue 3D and the N64, and some of it's completely feel and vibe. But the reality of the situation is, if you're just sitting down with Analogue 3D, popping a cartridge in and playing, you honestly really wouldn't have much of a difference between the two bits, outside of the fact that I really think that Analogue needs to work on the deinterlacing when it comes to something like Analogue 3D. But here is your test, knowing everything I've told you in the video. This is either Ultra HDMI or it is Analogue 3D on Legacy of Darkness. Watch all the footage, watch the cadence and the motion, look at the colors, look at the overall image quality, even listen to it as it is in the background, and you tell me whether or not this is Ultra HDMI or Analogue 3D. I'm assuming most people are going to be completely guessing at it, because the reality is, just like MiSTer FPGA, these three things are incredibly close. And again, you have to remember that the Nintendo 64 is a very old console. Some of the weird variances could just be down to degradation in hardware. There's absolutely no way for me to test that, because even if you had a brand new N64 in box, it would still be basically near to 3-decade-old manufactured hardware at this point in time. So the reality of the situation is, where is the baseline? What is the barometer? It is an impossibility to say, or at least unless you have a lab with probably millions of dollars worth of equipment, and I just don't have it. But that's the comparison between Analogue 3D and N64. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and that menu change there was one of the telltale signs so you can know which source it was. If you have any questions, leave them down below, but we're done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.